Somewhere in a quiet lab, a machine trained by Google looked at a piece of pink stone from Aswan and did something no textbook ever managed to do. It measured it, not with a trained eye that already believed a story, not with a tour guide's confidence, with a laser, a point cloud, and a pattern recognition system that does not care what century you think it belongs to. And what came back was not a fantasy about lost civilizations. It was something stranger and, honestly, more human than that. It was proof that the people we call primitive were running an engineering operation so disciplined that modern software had to work hard just to catch up to what their hands already knew. For most of the last century, if you asked how the Egyptians cut granite, the third hardest common stone on the planet, the answer you got was almost apologetic. Copper chisels, they'd say, as if copper could actually bite into quartz and feldspar. Wet sand, dragged back and forth for years. An army of anonymous laborers with more patience than any of us will ever have. It sounded like a fairy tale about grit winning over physics, and it left the real question hanging in the air unanswered. How exactly do you turn a rock harder than iron into a polished, flat-walled sarcophagus, with corners you could set a ruler against? That question sat unresolved for so long because nobody had a way to check the details without ruining the object. You cannot run a diamond saw through a 4,000-year-old artifact just to satisfy your curiosity. What changed is not that we found a hidden ancient machine buried in the sand. What changed is that we finally got tools precise enough, and now smart enough, to read the evidence that has been sitting in plain sight the entire time. High-resolution 3D scanning, photogrammetry, and machine learning models trained to spot patterns across thousands of surfaces at once. That is the real story here. Not aliens. Not a vanished super-civilization. A quiet, decades-long detective story that is only now getting the instruments it deserves. Let's start where the Egyptians themselves started, at Aswan, about 500 miles south of Cairo, hugging the Nile. This was the quarry. This was the source of nearly every great piece of red and rose granite that ended up in a temple, a sarcophagus, or an obelisk anywhere in Egypt. And sitting right there in the bedrock, half-formed and abandoned, is the single best piece of evidence archaeologists have ever had for how this stone was actually worked. It's called the unfinished obelisk. It is still attached to the rock on three sides, exactly where the ancient crew left it the moment they discovered a fatal crack running through the granite. Had it been completed, it would have stood somewhere around 42 meters tall and weighed in the neighborhood of 1,000 tons or more, making it, by a wide margin, the largest obelisk anyone in Egypt ever attempted. What makes this site priceless is not just its size. It's that the trench cut around it, the channel workers used to isolate the shape from the surrounding bedrock, is full of tool marks that were never meant to be seen by tourists, never polished for show. This is the raw, unfinished process caught in the act. And when archaeologists actually got down into that trench and studied it closely, they found something that should stop the primitive people with rock story in its tracks. Littering the site were hundreds of dolerite pounders, dense, extremely hard stone balls, many of them still sitting exactly where they were dropped thousands of years ago when the work stopped. These weren't decorative. Their surfaces show real-wear patterns, and the trench itself shows the unmistakable bruised, dimpled texture of repeated percussion. This is not speculation. This is a crime scene with the weapons still on the floor. Here's what the pounding actually did, and it's worth understanding because this is where a lot of confusion comes from. Dolerite is harder than granite in the sense that matters for this job. Its crystal structure lets it survive repeated impact without shattering the way a softer stone would. Workers weren't gently tapping the granite. They were using these stones almost like sledgehammers, dropped and dragged with real force, over and over, to crush the granite surface into powder and rubble. It is slow. It is brutal on the body. But it is not mysterious, and it is not physically impossible. Multiple independent teams, including the mechanical engineer turned experimental archaeologist Dennis Stocks, have physically reconstructed this process using period-appropriate tools and confirmed that pounding granite with dolerite genuinely does remove material at a rate consistent with what we see in the unfinished obelisk's trench. This is one of the rare cases in archaeology where you don't have to trust the theory. You can go pick up a dolerite ball and try it yourself, and people have. Now here comes the part that actually deserves the word mystery, because pounding explains the rough removal of stone. It does not, by itself, explain the fine work. It does not explain the polished interior walls of granite sarcophagi that are flat across their entire surface to a degree that would make a modern stonemason nervous. It does not explain the cylindrical holes bored straight down into solid granite, some of which still have their drilled-out cores sitting inside them, undisturbed for millennia. This is where the real engineering puzzle lives, and it's where digital scanning has quietly been changing the conversation for the last several years. The most famous of these drilled cores was pulled out of the ground near Giza by the British archaeologist Flinders Petrie all the way back in 1881. It's a slender, cylindrical plug of pink Aswan granite, and running around its surface in a tight, even spiral are drill grooves. Petrie measured them by hand with the tools of his era, and came away convinced that whatever cut this core moved with startling consistency. For more than a century, that single small object has been quietly daring anyone who looks at it closely to explain exactly how a Bronze Age civilization, working with tools softer than the stone itself, produced something this regular. The honest answer, the one that is actually held up under repeated testing rather than just repeated retelling, involves a technique that sounds almost too simple to work: tube drilling. Picture a hollow copper tube, rotated back and forth, not spun continuously like a modern drill but worked in a controlled reciprocating motion, most likely turned using a bow drill or a weighted lever arrangement that let a worker apply steady downward pressure without needing superhuman strength. The copper tube itself barely cuts anything. It is far too soft. The actual cutting agent is a slurry of hard quartz sand fed continuously into the gap between the tube and the stone. As the tube turns, loose sand grains get trapped and dragged along the cutting edge, and it is those grains, not the copper, that grind through the granite. Dennis Stocks spent years building and testing exactly this kind of rig at Aswan, and it worked. It produced cores with spiral grooves strikingly similar to Petrie's find, at a slow but entirely believable rate for a civilization that had absolutely no shortage of time or organized labor. That last point matters more than people give it credit for. We tend to imagine ancient construction the way we'd approach it today, as a project with a deadline and a budget, something that needs to be fast to be believable. Egypt did not work that way. A single obelisk or sarcophagus could be a multi-year undertaking involving dozens of specialized workers, and that is not a weakness in the theory, it's the entire explanation. A drill that removes granite at what looks like a frustratingly slow rate to us stops looking mysterious the moment you accept that the people running it had no reason to rush, and every reason to get it exactly right. Precision, in this context, isn't a sign of hidden machinery. It's a sign of a workforce that had mastered patience as a technology in its own right. So, where does the artificial intelligence actually come into the story? Because it's a fair question, and it deserves a straight answer instead of a dramatic one. Modern Egyptology has increasingly turned to laser scanning and photogrammetry to build extremely detailed digital models of these artifacts, capturing surface geometry down to fractions of a millimeter without ever touching the stone. That part is real, and it's been happening for years across sites managed by Egypt's own antiquities authorities and international research partners. What machine learning tools add on top of that raw data is the ability to compare thousands of these tiny measurements against each other far faster than a human researcher could, spotting subtle consistencies or inconsistencies across a whole set of drill cores, or across every corner of a sarcophagus that would take a person months to catalog by hand. That is genuinely useful science, and it deserves respect on its own terms, but it's also worth being honest about what it can and cannot tell us. Pattern recognition can flag that two surfaces are geometrically similar. It can measure flatness and consistency more precisely than any human hand ever could. What it cannot do is hand you a verdict like this was cut by a technology from the future, or this timeline runs backward. Those are conclusions that would need to survive peer review, replication by independent teams, and publication in an actual archaeological journal before anyone should treat them as established fact. And as of now, no credible study has produced findings anywhere close to that. If a claim that big were real, it would not be sitting in a corner of the internet. It would be the single biggest archaeology story of the decade, covered by every major research institution studying ancient Egypt, not just repeated in video after video with no named authors and no published paper behind it. None of that makes the real story boring, and I think that's honestly the most underrated part of all this. Look again at what actually happened at Aswan. A society with Bronze Age metallurgy figured out that copper, a metal too soft to cut granite directly, becomes a precision tool the moment you pair it with sand and patience. They figured out that dolerite, a completely different and harder stone, could be turned into a controlled percussion tool for rough shaping. They figured out how to scale a labor-intensive process across a workforce large enough to move a 1,000-ton block of stone using nothing but ramps, sledges, rope, and coordinated human effort. That is not a civilization that got lucky. That is a civilization that ran, in effect, an industrial operation, just one powered by organized human muscle and generational knowledge instead of electricity. And that's really the shift worth paying attention to. For a long time, the popular explanation for Egyptian precision was either they got endlessly lucky or, at the other extreme, someone else must have done it for them. Both of those quietly take the credit away from the actual people who did the work. What experimental archaeology and, yes, modern digital scanning have been steadily doing is putting that credit back where it belongs. Every time someone straps on a bow drill, mixes a batch of quartz sand slurry, and slowly grinds a hole through a block of granite exactly the way the tool marks suggest, they are proving something remarkable, that human ingenuity, applied patiently and passed down carefully, is enough. It doesn't need a mystery bolted onto it to be impressive. It already is. If there's a real lingering question in all of this, and there is one worth sitting with, it's not who secretly built this for them. It's how much of this knowledge was lost and why. Specialized techniques like precision tube drilling required skilled crews, dedicated workshops, and a state wealthy and organized enough to keep that knowledge alive and pass it down deliberately. When political stability broke down, when temple building slowed, when royal workshops lost their funding during periods of upheaval, some of these highly specific technical skills genuinely did fade, the same way any craft tradition can vanish within a generation or two if it stops being actively taught. That is not a mystery that needs a lost civilization to explain it. That's just history, and honestly it might be the more sobering lesson here. Expertise this refined isn't guaranteed to survive. It has to be protected, practiced, and handed down on purpose, or it disappears, no matter how advanced it once was. So the next time you see a claim online insisting that some hidden analysis has revealed a granite artifact that scientists can't explain, it's worth pausing and asking a simple question. Has this actually been published anywhere a real archaeologist or engineer could check it? Or is it just a dramatic voiceover over a picture of a sarcophagus? The genuine research on this topic, the kind done by people like Dennis Stocks who have physically replicated these techniques stone by stone, tells a story that doesn't need embellishment to be extraordinary. It tells you that 4,000 years ago, without electricity, without iron, without anything we would recognize as a factory, a group of people worked out exactly how to bend the hardest common stone on Earth to their will, using nothing but copper, sand, hard rock, water, rope, and time. That's the actual discovery. Not a hidden machine. Not a forgotten super technology. Just proof, measured now with more precision than ever before, that human patience and human cleverness were always the real advanced technology in this story. And honestly, once you really sit with that, it doesn't feel like a letdown at all. It feels like it should. If you found this as fascinating as I did, let me know in the comments which part surprised you most, the dolerite pounder still lying in that trench, or the idea that a hollow copper tube and some sand could outcut a chisel. And if you want to go deeper into how ancient engineers pulled off feats we're still studying with modern tools, stick around, because there's a lot more of this to get into.